When Lara saw Dan standing in a smashed bus stop, she was taken by how these were acutely similar circumstances to their first ever meeting. Dan, a foot taller than Lara since she could remember, always leaned to the left when he was standing upright, as he had done when she had first noticed him idling outside in the rain at the tender age of 7. She had left her school bag outside the huts, the colloquial name the children chose for two purpose-built rectangles that sat next to the main school building. Always leaking and always cold, the huts were erected to house the extra pupils who had emerged after the island's boom several years earlier, spawning newly settled couples fleeing the oily cities of the mainland for fresh pastures and eager to turn their small homesteads into family dwellings and set up a life that they believed would be both stable and interesting. Lara and Dan's families were island natives, and this had drawn them together, both sets of parents members of the neighborhood watch, their babysitter the same girl with pale blonde hair who smoked when she thought they weren't looking, and their doctor, an older man who never met your eye. Despite these crossovers and connections, Lara had only noticed Dan during that particularly wet and windy day, when they were both outside during school hours and afterwards marked as deviant in their school records. As Lara had approached Dan, his foot sinking slowly into the ground that had been improperly dug during the hut's construction, he had made a pointing gesture with his hand, signaling for her to look over her shoulder. Their head teacher, a spindly woman with a laser beam glare, stood in the doorway of the entrance to the main building, hands on hips, her bony frame reminding Lara momentarily of a heron, but far less elegant. She ducked down and ran towards Dan, pulling him with her as they made it to the tree line on the perimeter of the school grounds. "Close one," she said, and he looked down at her, then toward his mud-encrusted foot. "Shit, my mum's gonna have a heart attack," he trailed, hitting his heel against a tree trunk to try and break off the clumps. "It's too wet, you'll need to let that dry up, I should know. My dad is always traipsing dirt across the house, gives my mum a total meltdown." Dan laughed in reply, and this was the beginning of their friendship. Later, Dan would learn that Lara's dad owned the company that had recently fired his own father, forcing a crack in his parents' marriage that neither intended to mend. His mother moved back to where she had come from, a whole 500 miles away in a city with a museum and more franchised coffee shops than he thought necessary. Dan had never mentioned this to Lara. They had grown up together, supporting each other through the toughness that island living brought, the isolation and uncertainty. He saw her now, ambling toward him with her canvas rucksack slung over one shoulder adorned in badges and patches and her newly buzzed head a fuzzy half-moon underneath her hood, her warmth like an aura. "You're late," he said, pulling her into his chest and hugging her tightly, as if he hadn't seen her for ages, as if they hadn't been up all night at the weekend watching horror films and sharing the one joint she had managed to nick off her brothers. "Sorry, it was Dad," and before she could finish, Dan took her by the shoulders, which was a sign that she did not need to continue and that he understood without the words being spoken. "Okay, let's go." When walking along the rocky shoreline, a visitor might believe that there was no flat sea beyond the horizon. A wall of boulders did well at drowning out the sounds of waves and sea birds, a distant foghorn, or the rising voices of people doing things on, and to, the beach. Once the climb was made over the lowest peak, the gravel made way for sand and hardy shore plants. Anybody walking here, or moving in any way except by vehicle, would find their feet sinking softly into the dunes, shells, and seaweed scattered in secret patterns that emerged during low tide. Dan and Lara knew the scenery well, having spent many summers swimming in the always freezing waters and huddling together afterwards in the cavernous parts of the wall built to protect the rest of the land from flooding. Half human-made, half natural, the beach stretched for miles until the boundaries of the disused air base towards the west, and at the eastern point, no one really knew what happened there, as the tide always came in before anybody had the chance to properly explore. Once, during a particularly hot June, Lara had dragged a kayak from her neighbor's shed all the way down to the beach, calling Dan with a proposition. "I can't hear you. Are you swimming?" he asked, sitting in his bedroom with the windows open, trying to peer out to the shoreline, convincing himself he could see her bobbing head despite his house being over a mile away and pointing towards a different part of the beach. "No, I've got Vince's kayak. Let's go to the edge." They hadn't made it, Vince calling the only on-duty police officer regarding his missing and presumed stolen kayak, the officer happening to be Dan's father. Dan was in the back of the police car when it showed up on the sand to take Lara home, and after an explosive argument between Vince and her father, the charges were dropped. She was only 13 at the time, yet Vince, in his 70s and devout to some strange religion he had picked up overseas, made it his life's mission, regardless of its tapering end, to hate that girl, the one who stole his vessel, his only form of escape. On this day Lara and Dan had decided to visit the beach out of boredom, one that had grown from their lack of funds, which often took place towards the end of the month. Both had been signed on to the dole for most of their short adult lives. Well versed in the kind of spiel needed to win over the one employment officer who had to make the daily trip by boat from country to isle, their bank accounts were not precious to them in the same way that they had been brought up to believe. Money never stuck to them, Dan would say, poetically and often in a deep South American accent to make Lara laugh. They believed in value beyond the tokens that had marred their childhoods and caused everyone around them such distress. They sought the benefits of a liberated life, free from the chains of financial acquisition and fiscal regulation. Their currency was adventure, as Lara had put it, repeating the line again as they trudged along shifting sands. Dan had started to regale her with one of his stories that he so often liked to tell when they were in this mode, as in, with no money, even though they said they didn't need it, or believe in it for that matter, yet still desiring security in some form, and a more decent lunch than the end of a loaf of bread that Dan had scooped from the bottom of the bread bin and the apples Lara had picked from the tree that dangled over the fence from Vince's garden. Dan's stories were always set during an unknown war, with skies of phosphorus, and the charred remains of life below. Dark and violent, Lara enjoyed them until Dan began to include elements of an otherworldly origin, her mind incapable of traveling off this planet. They paused so that he could prise a razor clamshell out from the wet clay-like sand, whilst describing a tower that stood on an island much like this one all those years ago. An outpost, but an eerie one is how he described it, whilst freeing the shell and holding it in his hand for a moment. "Weren't they all eerie?" Lara replied. "What with being lookouts for the machine of death that is war." He rolled his eyes at her, then started digging at the sand with the shell, quickly making a hole big enough to fit a fist, then an outstretched hand, until a shallow wave filled it with salty water, along with their shoes. "Yikes, these ones have holes in, and actually most of them do at this point," Lara reacted, jogging toward the land, turning to face the crouching figure of Dan as the water lapped swiftly at his ankles. "It's coming in. We best get moving," she called over to him as she walked backwards, her heels submerging into the ground as the cool air of late afternoon rose around her. Dan ignored her, his mouth moving as he carried on sharing the story with himself, digging and redigging as the water continued to draw inwards in sheets. "Fine," she said, and squatting down herself to keep warm as the wind took on a briskness within what felt like seconds. The plain of sand in between herself and Dan was pretty flat except for her footprints and the opaque bubbles of mermaid purses and egg rack. She shouted at Dan again, and this time he responded, throwing the clam shell into the water and running towards her with his soggy calves and sea-slicked trainers. About halfway, he stopped abruptly, again peering down towards a cluster of what looked like from a distance a heap of mussels. "You found an unexploded mine from your war," she laughed. Dan pointed to her without looking up, the same gesture he had made during their first interaction, only this time he proceeded to use his finger to beckon her over. Lara walked slowly towards him, mimicking a soldier with a gun in her hand, looking through a pretend eyepiece at Dan's face, which was emotionless. "I could so get you with a headshot," she retorted, finally appearing next to him, holstering her weapon. She followed his gaze to the ground, where she was met with a selection of greasy lumps. Coiled together like mating slugs, the lumps were iridescent underneath Dan's phone torch, which he had activated within the moments it took for Lara to reach her own device. "What are they?" she said, her voice sounding distant as her mind sharpened its focus on the objects, racking itself to find an answer. "Dunno, they look like they were alive once," he replied, his hand trembling slightly as it shifted the beam of light between each deposited mound. "They?" Lara picked up a small plastic lollipop stick that lay discarded beside her, and pressed it onto the thing. Nothing happened, and she pocketed the stick, now existing in close proximity to the twisted receipt and a single stem of dried lavender. "Wait now, what did we learn from Fossil Worlds, the story of us? Never touch a fossil until you know what you're dealing with." He sat down properly now, fully engaged with what he was looking at, unaware that the tide was approaching eagerly behind them. "Screw that." Lara dropped her bag to the ground and she touched the objects again all in one motion, only this time with the soft tips of her fingers, her attention momentarily positioned between her own body finding a comfortable sitting position in the wet sand, and the feeling that shot through her hand, up her arm, and into her chest. As she connected with them, the objects changed. Their outward appearance went from glistening flesh to brittle and bone-like, immediately drying up and beginning to disintegrate in the escalating gale. "Where's it? What's happening?" And continuing to ignore the invisible but not unpleasant weight that was now pressing down on the space where her lungs were and moving down into her abdomen. "I'm not sure," Dan said, quickly pulling a small plastic bag originally meant for collecting dog feces from his pocket, capturing some of the silt in it. The objects, now ash before them, remained solid only in their memories of the preceding moments and in a drawing Dan later produced, to convince people of what happened next.